Jon is a philosopher, a psychoanalyst, and a clinical psychologist. He's on the faculty in the postgraduate program in psychoanalysis at the Gordon Derner School of Psychology of Adelphi University, where both of us got conscripted and enjoy our work. Jon is teaching remotely, even before COVID, from Canada, which is where Jon hails from. Toronto, I believe. Jon, have you ever run into my daughter who's in Toronto? She teaches at the University of Toronto. No? Okay. She's the brains of the outfit. I just tag along for the ride. She's one bright cookie. Jon is an emeritus professor of psychology and psychoanalysis at the Adler Graduate Professional School in Toronto. He runs a mental health corporation in Ontario. He's the recipient of numerous awards for his outstanding work in the field. And one of the awards is the Gradiva Award. That's the only thing that Jon and I have in common. That's the only thing. His is for writing a book. Mine is for writing an article. Not quite the same. He's the author and or editor of 25 books. All are very scholarly, including books on philosophy, psychology, and cultural studies, such as Debating Relational Psychoanalysis, Inventing God, Underworlds, Conundrums, it's a wonderful book, by the way, which is a critique of contemporary psychoanalysis, Origins of the Genesis of Psychic Reality, Treating Attachment Pathology, The Unconscious Abyss, Hegel's Anticipation of Psychoanalysis, and The Ontology of Prejudice. In 2015, he was the recipient of the Otto Weininger Memorial Award for Lifetime Achievement given by the Canadian Psychological Association. A very tough award to come by. Jon is going to regale us not only with his presence, but his scholarly disposition. He has what Roy Schaefer calls the psychoanalytic attitude. To me, that's the best thing one can have with respect to treating people and training people. So without any further ado, I now hand you Jon Mills, and he will take over from this point on. Jon, it's all yours.
Well, thank you for that embarrassing introduction, Bert. There's something humiliating about hearing about yourself. I'm sure it's based upon my own childhood traumas, but thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted. I guess I thought I would start. I mean, I usually, when I go to conferences, I read a paper, but when I do workshops or seminars, I just like to lecture, and so I'm not sure what you would prefer. I can speak for a certain period of time, and then I can pause and take questions, and then can continue with what I had planned. Or would you prefer that I wait till the very end and then give about 15, 20-minute discussion? Any preferences?
What would be relational?
Who's related? Who's related?
I said that. What would be relational?
Make an executive decision here now because of the size of the group here and because we're operating. Why don't we take questions and answers at the end and do it via chat? People will write in and they'll either read what they've written or I'll read it, and that way we can go from there. So if you wouldn't
I don't know how to do that.
Agree with you, just
that sounds fine.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess I should start with an overview of the relational movement and how I came about understanding it, and then leading to my critiques. And this would be the first of 4 workshops I had planned. So basically, in 1983, I think most people would agree that the relational movement had its genesis with Jay Greenberg's and Stephen Mitchell's Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory publication. And this is where they had set out to differentiate their relational structural model versus Freudian drive theory structural model. It generated a great deal of attention. Keep in mind that Greenberg and Mitchell were young psychologists at the time. They were at the William Allen White Institute, which of course everyone knows is the interpersonal institute and training environment on the East Coast. And it generated a great deal of interest and controversy by having this perspective presented. Now, I as a young guy, I was a kid. I mean, in fact, in that age, I mean, I just graduated high school. I mean, Jesus. But it was in 1988 that Stephen Mitchell wrote Relational Concepts in Psychoanalysis. And that was a text that I was introduced to in graduate school when I was getting my my PsyD in clinical psychology in Chicago. And I just, as a younger person, I mean, it's really hard for me to think in terms of who I am today. But I remembered the excitement about it. The professors at the time that I had seminars with introduced this book. I consumed it. And the notion in Chicago at the time was that you had Kohut with self-psychology. You had Merton Gill, who was my supervisor, came from the interpersonal tradition. And the notion of relationality is being introduced in the first time. As at the time, it was more like a conglomeration of the two in my head, not according to Merton, of course. Merton was very territorial, but Mitchell and Merton were colleagues, and so I felt a certain attraction to the relational movement from its beginning. Now, I should say that after I had left, or after I graduated, got my degree, I had an academic appointment in psychology, and in that time, I had become very friendly with the philosophy department at my university, and I decided that I really fell in love with that field, and I went back to school masochistically to get a second doctorate. But I was lucky this time because I got a full fellowship to Vanderbilt University, and so they paid a $200,000 education.
Wow.
So lucky me. But at that time, I was keeping up on the readings. Jay Greenberg wrote Oedipus and Beyond in 1991. And then Lou Aaron was talking about his book, A Meeting of the Minds, in 1996. These were all pillars of the relational movement that we know today. That led to a compilation of like an edited book that Steve and Lou put together, called the Relational Psychoanalysis, The Emergence of Tradition. And at that time, they were calling themselves a tradition. But as we know now, it's gone into an international movement, which I'll get back to. But the relational camp is one, but at the same time, you have another relational camp, and we call it intersubjectivity. So you have Bob Stollerow, George Atwood, who are writing about intersubjectivity. So at first, they were interested in introducing a psychoanalytic phenomenology. So in about the same time, in 1984, you have Structures of Subjectivity come out. Followed up by 1987, a book with Brandshaft 2. Orange joined later with Worlds of Experience in 2002. But they're talking about the intersubjective framework. And this is clearly a relational framework, in my opinion. And the two domains are happening relatively at the same time. I'm saying all this just a little bit of a background because I'm reading this literature. And another very influential text, at least to me it was, came out in 1990, and that was by Fred Pine. And it was called Drive, Ego, Object, and Self. And Pine articulates nicely the major movements of the psychoanalytic domain, starting with Freud and drive theory or classical theory, and then moving into the ego psychology movement of focusing on defense. But at the same time, the object relations movement was happening. And then it was later that self-psychology came into being or came on the scene. And these are all the things that predated the relational movement. So, of course, on another level, you have the American interpersonal movement that had started in the 40s and 50s at White. And that was in response to this classical authoritarianism that they wanted to escape from, at least how they interpreted it. So what had happened is that these things were in my early education, and I came back to it. I was out of the psychoanalytic world for about 5 years because I was learning a new discipline, and I was learning the history of Western philosophy in particular, and what I noticed is a big difference in our training. So in clinical psychology, academic, yet a practitioner model, was very oriented toward clinical work, not empirical work. That's not where I came from. And so I read tons of stuff. I immersed myself in the field, but it was primarily through secondary texts. And so it was when I went to Vanderbilt where I became a Freud and Hegel scholar. I didn't really read the original texts of Freud. That's when I got the standard edition. That's when I got the Gesmalte Werke, or the collected works in German. I had to learn German. It was a horrible experience. So did my ancient philosophy. It was horrible finding to learn that. Delayed me, actually, by a whole year of getting my PhD. But regardless, it was a good lesson in discipline. So I learned right away that I was expected to read the original texts. And when I started to read Freud in detail, I realized what I was taught in my psychology program was, hearsay, second-hand at best. And I started to develop my own way of thinking. So when I graduated, I actually had a Fulbright scholar. I was a Fulbright scholar at University of Toronto and York University, where I could do more research, and I finished my dissertation there. I could not get an academic job. I applied in both philosophy and psychology, and white male, Pagel guy, or I don't have an empirical research program, so I had to go back into private practice. So I established myself, worked in the hospitals, and then I opened up my own private practice. I completed my psychoanalytic training, etc. So when I get back to the field and I'm starting to digest all the literature, particularly in the journals, I'm immediately shocked by how philosophy is being presented to psychoanalytic audiences. And this is where I got interested in critiquing this relational school, or the relational movement. And at first I had written a few scholarly books before I started doing this. And when I wrote a paper, I wrote a paper that was published in Psychoanalytic Psychology. It's the one I sent to the group. And what happened was that critique article immediately generated controversy. The controversy, actually, when I think about it, came when I got a blind review. I mean, this is the editor sends these out to 3 blind reviewers, and one of them just tore me to pieces. And I remember I remembered in my head that the first 3 pages were just wonderful, and then when I got to the 4th page, I just wanted to throw the whole thing in the garbage. Mm. So this is I made my modifications based upon the critique, or the reviewer's critique. It gets published. And right before the journal came out, the article came out, I gave a couple talks at the Division 39 meeting, and on a couple panels. And one of them, I had no idea what was going to happen. And I'm a young guy. I mean, come on, I'm naive. So I did a panel with Neil Altman and Roger Freed. And so I have my little critique I want to talk about. And the audience became extremely hostile. And what I mean by the audience, I mean Altman, I mean Erwin Hoffman, and Jody Davies. And it's something I never encountered before, but nevertheless, this was like the prelude to the publication. And when the publication comes out, I get a spattering of people who want to respond, and at the time I'm pleased about this. I'm getting some attention, but keep in mind that in philosophy, we are taught to argue. We're taught to think critically and deconstruct people's points of view, and that's the norm. What isn't the norm is to go after sacred cows and to challenge people's thoughts, at least that I discovered in my experience in psychoanalytic circles. So anyway, controversy happens, people respond, and you saw my response to them. Well, that meaning my response to my critics, that led to Hoffman, Davies, and Altman wanting to respond to my comments, or my commentary, my response to my critics, without me being able to have a further response to them, which went against the journal's protocol. And it became a big brouhaha. the Publications Committee of Division 39 had to meet. So I was censored. I was censored from responding to my critics, and I would have let the whole thing drop. I mean, I didn't care about this. This is just one paper. And at the same time, I published an edited book on a critique, basically relational and intersubjective perspectives in psychoanalysis. But that subtitle, a critique, was enough to irritate some people. Because I was censored, I felt, well, I'm pissed off, that shouldn't happen. So I start reading all of the literature, and I decided that I was going to write a book on it. And at that time, I mean, there are so many different people, and of course now it's different, but at the time, like we're talking 2005 on up, you had all kinds of relationally identified people that were making extremely important contributions. I don't want to diminish any of them. I wouldn't have taken my time, to write a critique if I didn't value what they're doing. So you had a number of mainly East Coast groups. You had, Jessica Benjamin and Thomas Ogden talking about the third. Benjamin was largely relying upon Hegel's theory of recognition, not his logic, but on that particular notion of master-slave dialectic. Introduced that to psychoanalysis. You have, at the same time, you have this massive resurgence of interest in attachment theory. So you have attachment researchers, you have the infant observation people. So Beatrice Beebe, you have Joseph Lichtenberg, you have Frank Lockman, you have James Fossage, and that was more or less in the States. In the UK, you had Peter Fonagy, Mary Target, and a very, very large research group. I mean, massive research group. And that's the psychoanalytic people that are interested in attachment are a bit different than the developmental people. So like developmental psychology, but they overlap. And so attachment gets picked up. It gets introduced into relational psychoanalysis. On the other end of things, you have people who are interested in clinical process. So you have Erwin Hoffman's, work on ritual and spontaneity, and you have Don Stern is talking about unformulated experience. You have Emmanuel Gant. You have Jody Davies. You have Harris and Adrian Harris and Demon, who's talking about gender, and you have Stuart Pizer talking about negotiating paradox. You have a little bit later, when I say later, more of the book, but not in terms of, it's around the same period, like the early 80s. You have Philip Bromberg. He's introducing different perspectives on dissociation. This is all ushered in the age of trauma. I mean, right now, we can't, if I hear one more thing on trauma, I'm going to puke. It's just nothing but this lingo. Now, it's not just to say it's not valuable. Of course it is. This is what we're talking about here. Developmental traumas this is what everything's about in the consulting room, at least my experience. But the relational movement has really, I think, energized the field in many ways, extremely energized the field. Some exciting developments is that we're talking about social justice paradigms for the first time, not, gender, transgendered issues that are being discussed. Eco-psychology. Now we're talking about, the environment and climate, our climate emergency. issues around immigration, about refugees, about torture, about human trafficking. We have what I would call a philosophical turn, some would call an ethical turn. There's a lot of interesting things that are happening. Now, at the same time, this is happening in response to other established movements. And as you might guess, just like in Freud's early circle, anything that is a threat or is introduced as novel thinking or that is potentially controversial could easily lead to alienation, exclusion, etc. When I wrote this, it led to my book on Conundrums, which is where I would say that's where I kind of made more of a splash in terms of a general critique of contemporary thinking. Now that led to me being, in many ways, I wouldn't use the word excommunicated because I wasn't really fully accepted into the fold. It's more of a sense of being alienated for the critique. Now, I'm someone who, based upon my reading of the relational literature or intersubjective literature, would say that I practice like a relational person. In the consulting room, I kind of get what you see. This is my personality. So, however, there's a big, discussion, debate around what constitutes relationality, and we can go on and on about this. One person's relatedness is another person's watered down version of what it should be. To lead to the end where basically a relational practitioner defines what they do, and I still struggle with exactly what that is. It obviously will vary from person to person. So that led to a series of book reviews, interviews. It endeared itself to some people who came out of the woodwork to support me, others who just, cut me out, lost friends, people wouldn't talk to me. I mean, literally would not talk to me at conferences. I remember, even though I was friendly with Lou Aaron, he basically said, I said, we had to collaborate on something. We had to do at least a panel. He says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that at this time. All of these people have been my lifelong friends, and I just can't do that. I was alienated from the Toronto Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis, where I was affiliated and had given plenty of talks and papers. So anyway, that's what happened. But then it led to an international conference on my book on Conundrums and in Israel. So I was invited to come and had a full day, had a couple hundred people attending. It was sponsored by the Israeli Forum for the IARP, the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. And those proceedings were then published in the relational journal Psychoanalytic Perspectives. However, another backstory to that is that the conference organizer attempted to try to publish the proceedings with psychoanalytic dialogues, and the editors didn't want to have anything to do with me. They just refused. So be it. anyway, that led to really, really good, introduced me to a lot of relational thinking in Israel. I met new friends, I developed new connections, and that led to new collaborations. Steve Kuchuk, who's the president of IARP now, he's the what I'd call second generation relationalist. Lovely man, much more open and to critique. And so that led to my book. Here's the Conundrums book that I was lucky enough to get a Goethe Award for, and that culminated in my last book, Debating Relational Psychoanalysis, where I put everything together. That, by the way, put a pitch in on that. If you're interested in those books, you can buy them on Routledge, and I'll give you a discount code. It is 30% off.
Wow. Return mine to Amazon.
Don't go to Amazon. No. You have to go to the Routledge site directly, because you get free shipping anywhere in the world, and the discount code is ADC, meaning author discount. ADC 21 2021. That will get you cheaper.
Huh.
So the sales pitch is off. This is I just kind of wanted to get this off my plate. I don't want to be known as the a relational critique guy. I don't want to die that way. But I do think that I wanted to extend an olive branch to the relational school. I think that in order for us to advance as a discipline, you have to be open to critique, whether it be from others, whether it be internally. And if you're not open to, a rigorous debate of ideas, whether it be, theory, whether it be clinical theory, whether it be applied praxis, whether it be around technique, if you can't have that dialogue and open discussion among people who have different points of view, you're just going to remain incestuous and insular. And we don't need to repeat what the traditional Freudians did. We need to be open to what other people are thinking. Now, we don't have to agree. And of course, that's not always fun. What's fun is debating ideas. However, I don't want to leave anyone thinking that I'm not identified with the tradition. It just is that I come into it from a different background, and that's why when I'm asked, have to pigeonhole myself into something, I prefer to refer to myself as an independent. I might have conceptual models that I prefer at certain times. I might tend to practice in a certain way, but I can't really identify as being in any particular camp. So my critiques were rather interested. My overall focus, I would say, I was rather interested in looking at the philosophical underpinnings of contemporary theory. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about the relational, the intersubjective, and the postmodern perspectives that we see in the literature. I'm not talking about neuropsychoanalysis. I'm not necessarily talking about, a critique of attachment theory, even though that's part of it. I wrote a book on that. And I of course, attachment's got to be an ontological feature of the psyche. How could it not be? This is why relationality is important. So people interested in, academic or empirical research I'm not critiquing those folks. It's too big of a topic. So I wanted to stay on the relational intersubjective postmodern kind of bandwagon that I see out there. Now I'll get into those terms in detail in future workshops. I just want to give you a background now. So starting with a philosophical underpinning is a little bit different than just theory. I want to know what drives the theory. Where is it coming from? What are their either their logical or hermeneutical foundations? And maybe it's because of my training. I'm trying to find my way into understanding a discipline. And when the discipline is variegated and not uniform, not integrated, not unified, we've got entirely a whole different realm of interpretations about what contemporary theory means. But contemporary thought, contemporary institutes have popped up, particularly in North America, from Los Angeles to New York to Toronto. That's all based in some ways in response to this movement. What I also wanted to look at was the theoretical relationship of relational thinking to more traditional or classical thought. What is different? What's changed? What's shifted? I also wanted to look at the clinical implications for therapeutic practice. This seems to be where the bread is, at least in my view. I think the way relational practitioners work is entirely different from your caricature of a classical analyst. And I say caricature too, because not everybody would act like what you read about how a classical analyst acts like in the consulting room. In fact, Freud in many ways was quite relational. I mean, it's astonishing what he had done in real life. I mean, seeing people in his, he had a home office just like me. You got that. You got a dog. He's got his dog in his office. He's smoking 10 cigars a day. He's having people stay for tea, coffee, having them for dinner. I mean, he's done all kinds of stuff. He has his clients come to him when he's going on vacation who are staying at the same hotel or the spa so he can keep his income up. During the war, he sees people in exchange, or he writes a paper in exchange for a sack of potatoes to take home. I mean, he established free clinics. I mean, come on. There's all kinds of stuff that when you're reading the relational literature, it seems to pit the classical people into a corner. We could say it's a straw man. It's a rhetoric. It's a trope. Yes, it is in many ways. But if any of us have had a classical analysis, my first one was with somebody who trained with Bion, and I was in graduate school. So that was painful. Just an interpretation machine, like a Pez dispenser, not connecting with anything. My second analysis was with a self-psychologist. My third was with a senior who trained was supervised by Winnicott and Kahn and Anna Freud. Mm-hmm. So I had kind of a gamut there. I didn't have your traditional relational practitioner, I guess, as of today, but it was enough for me to get a flavor of how people worked in the consulting room. I also was interested in my focus and my critiques is on political and ethical implications. What are the political, meaning like institutional politics, ethics in terms of how we practice, what we say, what we do in the consulting. And then I was also interested in points of consilience between this new school, this new view, as Morris Eagle would call, and our historical ancestors, where we have inherited the fruits of their labor and wisdom. So, how am I to phrase this? I think, let me use the binaries. We'll start with the binaries and we'll see how they might fray around the edges later. So the relational movement, I think, and I identified this, very much was a reaction to a classical model. So the notion of everything's about intrapsychic processes, being focused on the subject, on the individual, gaining insight, and through interpretation, interpretation of their internal conflicts, of their defenses, their resistances, their transference projections. That was one domain, and the domain seemed to present it. Unfortunately, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. One-person psychology, and they wanted to shift it to a two-person psychology. Well, I'll get into that later, but there's nothing one-person about classical theory. Just to say that, there's always you don't exist as a solipsistic monad that just floats out in the universe. I mean, no. All of our our psyches are always prefaced on our relation to others in the world. But that doesn't diminish the importance and significance of the internal world. And so this is where, the traditional focus was. Now, simultaneously, Freud, I mean, I'm not going to get into all this, this, but Freud, as the most rich and robust and complicated theory of mind and human nature that exists in all of the psychoanalytic canon. The only one that would rival that would be Jung. There's no way that anyone can just say that their approach would be more inclusive than, I think, Freud's corpus. Having read almost all of the standard edition, I say almost all because there's some things that are just not necessary for me to invest my time in. You get a flavor over time. You metabolize a theorist over time. And, Freud obviously started from nascency and then matured. So he wasn't particularly impressed with having to think the same thing and say the same thing all the time. His mind changed as other things changed. So many people are surprised that Freud was the founder of ego psychology and object relations theory. And by the end of his life, he's talking about attachment. And he's talking about the emotional connection to people as particularly the mother being the primary attachment figure for both sexes, both genders, the most primary person. So it's all prefigures Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, the whole attachment movement that was cleaved off. I mean, psychoanalysis did not want to include Bowlby in his group. The object relations movement wanted to have a clear bifurcation despite the fact that they interrelated in many ways. I'm digressing. Let me go back. Other points of contention have to do with the notion of neutrality, of abstinence, of the blank screen, and this is your experience of the analyst. And even though those are caricatures, in many ways I've encountered some of these people. Gruelingly, I had supervisors. I mean, I was lucky to have supervisors in Chicago. At one point, I had 9 people who were supervisors at my internship. And I got to go down to the Psychoanalytic Institute there in Chicago and meet with a senior analyst who trained with Kohut. He was dead by then, but yet he acted like a classical analyst. It was incredible. Merton Gill was more personable, but he was ferociously loyal, and he wanted people to view him his way. If you bring up Kohut, you get bristly, and so it does. You know, every group has its identifications and things like that. You just have to take what you can from each perspective and let that settle in. So I could see why this notion of, I don't want to be treated like an object, I want to be treated like a subject. I would like to feel like there's a human being in the room, not some emotionless blank screen, mindless blob who is staring at me and says nothing. Well, despite the caricature, there must be some kernel of truth to people's experiences of their analysts. And I think that the relational movement has opened up a permissible space where we can talk about things that dispute things and question things and act in ways that go against the old mold, which I'll get back to in a bit. Before I move on with that, is that just a corrective. Freud never wrote anything about a blank screen. That was just an invention. He said one should be opaque and act like a mirror and show back to the client what this client shows to the analyst. There's nothing blank about opacity, and a reflective mirror has nothing to do with the screen.
Good point.
And so, I mean, when I was reading these technique papers and these critiques, it's like, boy, Freud he's talking about empathy, he's talking about rapport, he's talking about connecting, and entirely different. And this is why reading the original text is so important for me, not just secondary stuff. So the minute I got turned on to that, it's like, oh, you can never trust what some commentary says. You have to go look at it yourself. And I'm really happy that one of my professors shamed the shit out of me when I was in Vanderbilt, because he says, all you're doing is quoting or referencing secondary sources. This is a poor paper. You have to revise it. So thank you. I needed to be shamed. I need a little help here. So it made me think differently. But again, to their credit, the relational folks were, it was a reaction against that kind of authority, or that classical imposition around technique, and what the classical psychoanalyst symbolizes Maybe they don't act that way, but what they symbolize to the profession. So the relational analyst, in many ways, I think symbolizes something different. They're like, if I may extend the analogy or the metaphor, they're more like the freedom fighter. You know, it's like they're against this officious ideology that we don't find that useful anymore. We don't find that helpful. They are challenging these authoritarian, principles and the culture of psychoanalysis at the time. That took a great deal of bravery to do. I mean, you can alienate yourself politically. You can, you could create enemies. You can't get appointments. I mean, I've had people tell me because of me, they've been associated with me, they couldn't get an appointment at NYU, for instance, as if it's my fault. But this tells you about politics. I mean, that's a different issue, but so I think they're largely in response to this. They wanted to have a technical and political reform to traditional perspectives. You might want to refer to it as a natural rebellion, or a theoretical revolution, or an evolution. But please, let's not pathologize it. Say it's acting out of their Oedipal, complexes and things like this. And unfortunately, when I encounter this with analysts, I don't know what to say. It just seems a bit odd when someone wants to psychoanalyze someone else's motives when they don't even know who they are. And they're just making, to me, their own transference projection. And, you start, and I think particularly if you're wrapped up in your own transference to authority or to, political motivations of wanting to get along with people or wanting to work their way up, that people don't think critically. It's like, I remember a Bionian said, the only thing that's real is the exchange of money. The rest is all transference. I said, are you out of your mind? This is a guy at a leading institute, he can just spew this stuff out and people don't challenge it. They don't question it. No, you have to challenge and question things that make no sense to you. Somebody says there's no such thing as the external world. It's all socially constructed by your own psyche, or it's co-constructed. And there's no such thing as objective reality. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, if somebody hits you in the head with a hammer, objective reality would be announcing its presence whether you like it or not. I mean, let's not get carried away with these binaries, but often that's what happens, that there's a positioning of bifurcations of thinking that are polarized, rather than, it's really about a matter of emphasis. It's what you want to, what's a little bit more important here, what you want to focus on. Some of the stuff that I was reading, like, the two-person psychology versus one person, the myth of the isolated mind, that's all hogwash. It's just tropes. These are straw men. They don't exist. The notion of there's no objectivity. What are you talking about? There's no objectivity. How do you talk about this in a more sophisticated way is the issue. There's different perspectives. There's parallel processes. There's overdetermination of these factors, and the way we come to grapple with them, I think, is important. But to use the binary to set into play a new position that's superior to an old position doesn't actually do you much justice. It just invites critique or criticism. Okay, so getting back to some of the good things. I'm going to go back and forth. This is kind of how my mind works. What I like, what I don't like, what I think is good, what I want to take away from as important as other things that are not quite right. But what does a relational analyst come to represent to the field? And we don't always know because everybody interprets this in their own way. So for instance, I think that the relational person is much more, they emphasize the phenomenology of the lived experience. They're being really focused in on the internal experience of a patient. At the same time, they're focused on their own internal experience. The lingo, we'll call it whatever, the dyadic attachment, you know, the intersubjective field, whatever you want to call it. But the emotional connection that takes place in the therapy, very important to, I mean, if you don't really have an emotional connection with your patient, how can you help them? I mean, it's not all about just interpretation and, you know, as if you're going to have the correct, you know, insight that the patient's going to take away. I mean, to be quite honest, in my 3 treatments, which spanned a total of 10 years with 3 different people at different times in my life, 20s, 30s, 40s, I don't think I really remember what somebody actually said that made a difference. It has to do with me internalizing their presence, feeling felt, feeling their connection, their humanness. I mean, that's, I think, what the relational sensibility is getting at. So affective attunement, not just listening for, you know, the slip, the compromise, you know, the symptom substitution, the unconscious communication, you know, not things just like that, but about the relationality that takes place naturally. It has to take place organically. It's not superimposed. And if it doesn't fit with you, your unique sense of self, your subjectivity, your personality with the unique subjectivity and personality of the patient, then that may lead to a lot of issues around impasse and ineffectual work together. Other things that the relational people start talking about is like the social construction or co-creation of meaning and creating the analytic environment. That seems to be, you know, I mean, it's debatable. I mean, you could say it was there in Winnicott. It was there with Fairburn. It's been there, you know, by other people. It's just, you know, Harry Stack Sullivan, etc. It's just being given a different spin, a different emphasis. The other thing, and I think this is important, the notion of mutual recognition, the notion of a mutual negotiation that takes place in the consulting room. And there's a creative space that happens there. This kind of language, whether it's imported from Benjamin, Ogden, the analytic third, which comes from Hegel, actually Fichte before that, a German idealist. Just like when Robert Stollerow, Bob, says he claims he's invented the word intersubjectivity. It's as if 200 years before him didn't count. So anyway, these are important things. The notion that the relational movement is challenging orthodoxy, challenging dogma. It's challenging the classical frame. And, you know, whatever that might mean, are the notion that interpretation really isn't the main thing about therapeutic action. It's just simply not about that. It's about yeah, I mean, obviously, interpretation is important, and coming to insight, and you know, excavating blind spots and unconscious processes and resistances and defenses. That's all part, of course, our work. But it seems like the emphasis is a bit different. Like what they did was they broke with this taboo against self-disclosure. You know, there's nothing, of course, more frustrating than this caricature of this silent, cold, staid, withholding analyst who says nothing when you ask a question or you ask their input on anything. I mean, when someone just becomes silent, emotionless, like a piece of concrete, how's that going to open up, you know, processes for growth and healing? So this is, I think, was the first kind of, well, maybe not the first, but the first movement that wanted to challenge some of these orthodox conceptions of technique. Also, we're going to get into self-disclosure in another talk, by the way, like to what degree is that helpful, useful, harmful, over the top, etc. But the notion that one can't disclose something, say something about themselves, I mean, like the veil of taboo has been lifted. It's just, how's that processed? What does one say? But the notion of saying nothing. Now, again, Freud didn't actually say that. The notion of abstinence is, in his words, non-interference. The notion of neutrality is the notion of just being open to whatever the client says, not taking a particularly preconceived idea and superimposing it on things. So this is the side critique I'll table for now. Anyway, the notion of how do we conceptualize the therapeutic encounter is reconceptualized by the relational school. You have more of a clear or honest discourse about what we do, how we actually think, how we feel, what we say in the consulting room. And you know, that's takes guts to do that. I mean, to write about your cases, you notice, I mean, you notice when you read a lot of historical material, how it's presented in ways of this is the right interpretation, or this was the best technique, or this is the way I related to a client, and it seems to all be fluff. You know, where's all the dirty, negative, crappy things that happen? It's all been like airbrushed out, and it's been doctored up to look so great and grand and there to you know, lift up the narcissism of the analyst's writing. So when people are talking about making mistakes, failures, countertransference, enactments, things that are bad or didn't go well, impasses, all this stuff is kind of like refreshing. I remember I attended the first IARP conference, which is actually it was in Toronto, and I saw Benjamin and Hoffman talk. I thought they were great. They're talking, they're not censoring stuff, and I was I was quite enthralled by seeing this talked about for the first time in professional space. But then, of course, so we see as the profession unfolds and more people talk about their case material, how you can go, whoa, that was a little bit too much, or that was a bit excessive, or maybe that was, of course, Jody Davies talking about, her lust for her patients, and flirting with her patients, and how they react when they're told, "I'd like to have sex with you." And it's like, holy shit. I said, whoa, that would get me arrested up here. Actually, in Ontario, that's against the law. It's what we call sexual abuse under the Regulated Health Professions Act. Could you imagine a white man, saying to a woman, an Alison, that I've had fantasies about having sex with you? Now, Warren Wilbur did that at a conference. He's from the White Institute, and he said his patient just became furious. So we got to be careful here. I'll get more to that later. But the notion of being more natural. There's a sense of feeling of care, of concern, if not loving feelings that develop, and they can be talked about when they develop naturally, even though with caveats. That there's a sense of a genuineness and this humanity that may take place between the relationship that develops. And of course, relationship is not something that's automatic. You can't expect it. It has to naturally develop over time. And it's not something, unfortunately, you have all these caricatures of the relational analysts this day. And I think the reason, is just how the movements has ballooned. You cannot deny the fact that there is popularity with this movement that's worldwide. IARP went from just basically an East Coast club to an international movement in 20 years. They have chapters in North America, Central America, South America, the Middle East, and Australia. They've attracted psychotherapists, mental health workers, counselors, social workers. There's an inclusivity that people are attracted to this. And you don't have to be ordained as an analyst and go through the rigors of institute training to feel some inclusion. And what's it based upon? In retrospect, it should be obvious. We all want to be related to. We all want to have a positive relationship with someone or people or society. There's currency to that. However, this can lead to people the therapists, analysts being much more revelatory in the consulting room, which has its own inherent conundrums. But being interactive, disclosing accounts of your own experience, whether it be in life, whether it be toward the patient, whether it be in the session, whether it be in publications or at professional conferences or professional space. You've got a different feel and a quality of what's happening with relational practitioners than perhaps you have experienced with traditional practitioners. There's also a permissibility about enlisting and soliciting perceptions from the patient. So instead of assuming that everything is a transference projection, that the analyst does nothing, brings nothing to the table, is a blank screen, and everything's projected, we all know that's bullshit. It isn't the case. Somebody sees my bald head and they've already had a transference thought that comes through their head that has gone through the infinite deferral of significations and unconscious semiotics that might connect them up to who's that bald bastard in their life. But nevertheless, I'm there. I'm a human being. I'm not just an object. So we have to acknowledge that we are present, and our subjectivity is to be interpreted not simply as a distortion. And so then you have a two-way street. You have two subjects negotiating that space, and that seems to make sense to me, seems to fit my experience. The other thing about enlisting, how do you perceive me, or what kind of, like even Lou Ehrer talked about that, what kind of, presuming that the patient is unconsciously attuned to his own internal conflicts, they're going to be picking up on that. That's all fair game to discuss. Depends upon how you like to practice it, how honest you want to be, how revelatory you want to be. Now, I just want to say, just the caricature, unfortunately, of all of the psychotherapist movements throughout the globe, you can get some really distorted views about what relational practitioners think and agree upon and do. I mean, I have a colleague who, well, a friend, who told me that he was testifying at a case in California about a therapist who had sex with a patient, and she, the therapist, psychologist, said, well, this is what relational psychoanalysis is about. It's about having a relationship, and it naturally would extend to sexuality. And he's over there cringing, like, this is not what this is not what goes on here. Let's hope it doesn't go on here. But it leaves a bad, a bad flavor, right? When things like that are happening. The other thing is the feeling that the relational practitioner could be just like a friend. You're just chit-chatting about stuff and not really dealing with depth. Almost all of the relational people would just say that's a caricature. It's not. It's a hostile thing to say. It's not like you have a rent a friend here. You're paying me to be your pal and chit-chat. However, one does have to question whether or not how much of an emphasis is placed upon the relationship. This is something that we really don't know. I mean, I don't know what goes on in the consulting room with Jody Davies and her clients, except for what she wrote about in her papers. It gave me a different feeling, like, oh, I'm not going to say that. But there's other times that I've said things or done things that would be palpably criticized by my colleagues. There's no question about it. I mean, like, my countertransference has been out the roof. The thing is do I willfully engage in it? Were they unconscious motivations? Were they based upon difficult moments? And let's say I did act out or had an enactment, that's what they call anything these days, but can I talk about it? Can I, be open about it? But that's the thing, is that there's more permissibility to talk about countertransference, whether it be between in public space and publications or talking about it with the patient. Now, things like the impasses, the role of affect, the role of intimacy, the role of sexuality, there are certain things that can be brought up that can be discussed mutually. But again, these are things that we don't really know how it's negotiated unless you're there.
John, in the interest of
Meaning you're there.
I'd like to open up it when you're ready. I'd like to open up
Oh.
the remainder of our time to some questions. So with that in mind,
Absolutely. Thanks, Bert.
those of you who have some questions, there are two ways we could do this. And I think the simplest way would probably be what I would prefer, which is to type in something in the chat section at the bottom of your screen. There's right in the middle of the screen on the bottom, there's something that says chat. And if you'll just click on that, you can type in what you want us to hear. And John could read it or I could read it, and we can go from there. John has covered the waterfront, and just when I thought there wasn't more to cover, John added more. And I'm sure there's more. This is an area that's replete with all kinds of interest. And just the idea of who Freud really was versus who people thought he was is a topic all by itself. And I appreciated John pointing that out. Those of you who wish to type in something, I've already received some people who have typed in other things. Please type in, go to the bottom of your page, where right in the middle with your cursor, it says chat. Type something in there, and John will try to respond to you. Otherwise, John, continue, and I'll alert you to when a chat comes in.
Yeah, just read it out to me then.
Absolutely.
Okay, if you want me to keep, this is a problem of mine. I can blab.
That's not a problem.
Yeah.
The benefit.
Somebody have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, yeah, tell me.
May I ask a question? Yes.
Where are you?
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Can you hear me well? It's Regina. Hello?
Go ahead, Regina.
I can hear you.
Okay, my question, is it possible to become a relational practitioner without studying the traditional foundation of psychoanalysis therapy?
Wow.
Well, I suppose anybody can, practice from a certain, model from what they're taught, without having any knowledge of history. But it would seem a bit odd, given that the movement has to define itself in relation to how it's evolved from our historical beginnings. So, like for instance, the one question is, how is a relational practitioner different from people who adhere to the British school of, middle school, Winnicott, Fairbairn, versus a self-psychologist, versus the interpersonal tradition? What's different from the relational point of view? when when our early history is already imported into this. So I think if you don't understand our history, it would probably encumber a practitioner, but it doesn't mean that it's not impossible to learn. This is a model that are based upon certain theoretical and technical parameters, and this is what I do.
Question.
Thank you.
Regina, you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sean.
Yeah, my feeling is that the field in general of just maybe everybody who identifies themselves as being psychoanalysts, there's more of a merging of the relational school with the classical school. I don't find a lot of pure classical analysts around today, and it seems like there's more of an integration of the two schools. I don't know how you feel about that or what you see. A lot of the ideas, a lot of the things that you're talking about today a lot of people may not identify as being, quote, relational, still use those ideas in their practice, even if they have a more of a traditional psychoanalytic training.
Thanks, Sheldon.
So I don't know.
I'm
Yeah,
kind of a Freudian wannabe.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, then, yeah, I would think that's certainly some of the major criticisms of the contemporary Freudians.
Mhm.
They would say, well, yeah, I mean, you're painting a picture that really didn't exist there. I don't really act that way. There are certain aspects, I think, of that are more a matter of emphasis. However, if you start with the premise that everything is relational or everything's intersubjective, and that's what Mitchell says, that's what Greenberg says, that's what Stollerow says, it's the basic stuff of mental life. You've already committed yourself to a philosophy of consciousness because you are privileging the conscious relationships that you have with others. And therefore, it displaces the primacy of an unconscious ontology. And there, the traditionalists would say, you're watering down the unconscious here.
Mhm.
And where's the focus in the treatment? Aren't we, is it, yes, I mean, in many ways, some of the observations that everything's based upon the primacy of relatedness or intersubjective ontology is just stating the obvious. That, but what it's not stating is how our relationships are unconsciously filtered and organized. And so I agree with you, Sheldon, that I imagine that most people are more integrationists than we would see as pure models. And how could you be in this day and age? It'd be pretty tough if you're not conversant with the contemporary climate. It'd be tough to have discussions with people. But based upon our primary identifications with our preferred theories, it probably is what determines the differences.
Dr. Mills, I actually had a question, if you can hear me. I'm a candidate at the Institute, so excuse me if I have a few misconceptions about the relational model. But I read the Jody Davies paper you were referring to in your talk, and I know you touched about this a little bit today, but the thing maybe I'm not fully understanding is looking at the therapeutic alliance in this way, the process, it seems like it could, and you mentioned this very quickly, like kind of become kind of a justification for enactments or bad behavior on the part of the analyst. So I'm kind of just wondering, how is that like kind of policed in the relational school? Like how within that community, if everything like kind of has to do with the relationship, and somebody can very easily say, yeah, I know it kind of sounds maybe a little out there that I did this, but it felt like the right thing to do given the relationship between me and the analysand. How is it kind of like discussed? Is there like maybe a little bit more of a concreteness there, like, no, you shouldn't do that, no, you should do this?
Ooh.
Well, that's a good question. And I first of all, I want to say that Jody Davies is brave for talking about these things in print. Her honesty. I admire the fact that she has that kind of gumption, because it broke the mold. It's like, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to say what really happened, and I'll be judged based upon it. But if we can't have honest discourse about what really happened, then we're deluding ourselves. So I admire her for that. Of course, when you talk about what you do and say in the session, you open yourself up to criticism and critique and judgment, whether you like it or not. And so this gets into the topic that I was going to spend a lot more time on in a future seminar, about the dangers of self-disclosure, let alone self-revelations. Is there a guidepost to help us navigate these things? Particularly when you mention that, in the moment, in the context, the contingency, to give an analyst, the benefit of the doubt, they're likely bringing their clinical judgment and thoughtfulness together in an emotionally charged moment, and this is what comes out. Whether it's a slip, whether it's a mistake, whether it is a boundary crossing, a boundary violation, etc., is open to critique. To say this is a hard and fast rule that you shouldn't say this or do that, versus you should say this and do that, I'm not comfortable making that judgment call. But, of course, the paper we're talking about is Love in the Afternoon. It's basically her career seems to center around that paper. It invokes all kinds of questions. I guess the issue is, if I told my patient directly that I fantasize about her, I'm lusting over her, I'm having dreams or sexual fantasies about this client during the day, things like this, which she in some ways says in her paper, and the patient, who sounds like it might be a graduate student, a younger graduate student, ends up smashing his fist into the palm of his hand, starting to bawl his head off, and saying that she should be arrested or turned in to the Children's Aid Society or whatever it might be. Sounded like, boy, that went south real quick. If anything, I learned I'm not going to do that. Now, I wouldn't do that for a number of reasons, but it doesn't mean that it wouldn't lead to some kind of development in the treatment. And because I'm not there, I can only play the armchair quarterback. But as a general rule, I shy away from those kinds of disclosures.
May I ask? Oh, go please. Go ahead, Leanne.
Okay, yes, thank you. I found your talk very interesting. And I found it to be enticing, to the extent that it makes me want to have a little bit Can you hear me? I'm not frozen, am I? Okay. It makes me want to have a little bit of a debate with you. I don't know what that is. That's my countertransference, I guess I'll say. But I would say that when you're talking about revealing something that the analyst is feeling in the room, it should always be done with analytic thinking and in the service of the patient. And there are moments when revealing something that's happening between them is very useful to the patient. So it's not, I mean, it can be misconstrued as sort of willy-nilly self-disclosure, but it should be done with a lot of thought and caution. And so, I mean, I don't want it to be misconstrued in the way it's being talked about right now, because it's a very useful tool.
Well, I'm in agreement with you. Where's the debate? Did I miss it?
Okay, I didn't get into the full. If you didn't feel like, you know, I think this might be that philosophical dialectic, a chance to kind of argue through the nuance within certain theories and techniques. I mean, there's a lot of room for understanding, and nothing is so rigidly structured that it's fully, you know, appears and it turns out to be the simplest form of itself. It's much more complex. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean,
again, I'm in perfect agreement. This is why I wanted to make sure that I am being fair about it. It's easy to pick on you know, these details out of context, not taking into account the contingencies of the events, the history, the relationship. We don't have privilege to that. We only have privilege to what was written in the one paper. And in fact, what you're saying is the beauty of the approach, is that it's a lot more subtle, supple. You know, we just can't with a broad stroke just say that's bad, unless we're there. And yes, I would say that we've all had these moments where we're in the moment and something happens, whether it be magical, whether it be taboo, but there was some reasoning that was part of the clinical judgment and process. So I agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have to be careful before we just jettison a certain approach without fully understanding the context.
This is the part of the evening that I hate the most, because we now have to wrap it up. Jon, you've done a marvelous job, and I think this is just the tip of the iceberg.